Thanks so much, Ajay. We'll continue with the discussion. So we have a final presentation, then we're going to go into an activity. But the activity only works if you listen to this presentation, right, Julia? I might get a bit confusing. So please
Yes.
be very attentive to the presentation and also what Ajay shared, but we made the activity wider than the Shen program. But please listen carefully because it gets confusing, and feel free to write in the chat at any time if there are questions, because things get complicated very quickly as we talked in the last session. But there's hope, and we're going to work through this together. Thanks, Ajay, for sharing the case study and giving us really insights on how the program adapted really to the context and with experiences. But as you demonstrated, and you demonstrated a really important principle that cuts across all monitoring, you guys didn't try to monitor all the information available and absolutely everything. You made choices. And I think it's important to think about how you make choices. And we saw in the first Mentimeter, some of you said like how, methods to do that or how to measure change. So this is what we're going to focus on in this part of the section. And we're going to step back a little bit, still focusing on Ajay's case study, but relate it back to principles and frameworks of monitoring programs. And this section doesn't explicitly focus on participatory methods, because we'll do that afterwards and then see how this combines with participatory methods. But we would like everyone to be on the same page on what monitoring is and how it can be effective for program purposes and learning. Yeah, but with the question in mind, how do we make choices for monitoring? So Ajay's choices on what to monitor was really organized around his theory of change, which he shared with us today, an understanding of how these activities would lead to an impact in the given context. So the video you saw in Ajay's presentation gives a kind of overview of Shen's original theory of change. And note that a theory of change can be very simple or it can be quite complex. And James will go into that a little bit more in session 3. But the change the team wanted to see was women becoming conservation actors in Spiti as primary conservation in the snow leopard habitat. And to do this, they saw 2 to 3 main constraining factors, and that related to the income coming into the hands of women, collective action of the women developing handicrafts, and linking with other conservation actions, as this was expected to improve attitudes of women and then lead to conservation action locally, which ultimately would lead to this change that was expected on women really becoming conservation actors. I mean, this was the basis for the program and what they were thinking as they brought forward initially. So a common way to express our theory of change is using a results-based framework. And I just want to note that this by no means is the only way to do it, and is the only way to do it in M&E programs, but it's useful because you kind of see the linkages between the different steps of the program, and you see how these relationships between the different steps from your activities to the goal. So that's why it's a nice framework to kind of use, and especially when we explain what monitoring is. So you might have remembered this from the first program, the first session, and it kind of represents a results-based framework, and it helps us fill in that missing middle, which is this part, right? How did we get from the activities to our goal? And in an ideal world, this is very much ideal world, our programs have these different steps, right? Specification of our activities, which lead to intermediate kind of results, and then long-term results, and then that leads to our goal. And we seek to measure these at different points of our program to demonstrate that we're reaching our goal. So we try to find indicators along the way to reach towards our goal. So how does the Shen program fit within this framework? And that's what we're going to do first and try to see how it comes together. So first, we'll go through each of these different steps of the result framework. So in terms of inputs, I think this is normally easier to understand. It's important to articulate what these inputs might be. And inputs are from raw materials you might need to conduct your activities. And I just wanted to ask everyone, put in the chat, what are inputs that you think were important for the Shen program that Ajay shared? Just any ideas. I mean, and maybe there are wider inputs that you think maybe are important in your context that you could include. Please feel free to write in the chat. Just to let's see if what kind of ideas people have. Just going to open the chat. Okay, trainings. People, so Becky's saying trainings. Or trainings. Feel free. I mean, there's no number of women. So Nilufar, think about the inputs. These are things you're putting into the program. So it's less who's participating, but well, I mean, number of women, it's more like time, money, financials. Yeah, great. Super. So these are budget, time. I see a lot of people saying time, and I think that really highlights one of the partners' principles about presence and really investing in relationship, advocacy materials, assessments. Okay, great. So I see a lot of really nice ideas. So indeed, this is normally about items such as money, staff, training materials, raw materials to get the program started. And as we know, for a conservation program, it's really helpful to think about the time investments, because the relationship and trust building investments that we do put in to these programs through informal or formal meetings with the local community, and which are really critical to the success of the program. Okay, so those are inputs. Now let's think of activities. So we all know what activities are. So this is more easier to kind of understand. And then this is the work we do. And sometimes in M&E, activities are referred to as processes in M&E language. So what are some activities that Ajay shared were really important to the Shen project? Again, feel free to write in the chat. Some key activities that you thought were really important. And activities is where many programs find easier to monitor, right? Because the things we do, so it's easier to track. So feel free, trainings, yeah. So I would call trainings more activities. The training materials could be the inputs, for example, and the time, that's the inputs. But the activities is more the training, workshops. So manuals might be more inputs. So it would be like engaging with the communities with the manuals. Okay, and the capacity building workshops taking place, maybe surveys, maybe research that could support this program. Okay, really nice. So, woo. Okay. Those were really nice examples, and here are a few more. They're like training events, meetings, exposure visits, maybe the women traveling outside to Delhi or to other areas within India, informal gatherings. And the hard part though is we don't want to monitor all of these, because we have the tendency, it's easier to monitor everything, and we might have to make choices about what to monitor of these activities that are critical to our program. So we'll talk about later about how you can make those choices. Now it gets a little bit more complicated, so please stay with me. And if you have questions, please write in the chats. The next is outputs. So the output are the results of our activities. They are proof that our activities happened. So we often express them as numbers or amounts, and they can be measured or counted right after the activity is completed. So what might be some outputs related to the Shen program? And this might be is more difficult. So just give it a try. Ooh, how do I make this smaller? Okay, conducting training work. How many products or cost of the products women's produce? Really nice, Nadia. Yes. So that's the that's the result of our activities, how many products they produced, what products they produced. The income, yes, that's the result of the activities we did. Okay, these are great. How many women participated? Really nice, Kaliun. That's the result of our activities. Number of women trained. Yeah, really, really nice. So outputs are also easier to measure because they're the results of our activities. And they might be, I've listed some of the things you guys mentioned, like number of women trained, the profits, the amount of earnings. And in terms of the Shen program, they found that the key things to monitor, as you heard Ajay share, were related to costs, right? Around the income, how much income women were making, or the cost of the products or the profits that generated. And these ended up being really key to inform how their program went. And now we're going to go to the outcomes, which can be quite difficult to distinguish between outputs. I know I struggle, but it's nice to think of outcomes as the ripple effects of our activities and what's happened as a result of our activities and outputs. So the difference between outputs and outcomes, it's not so clear in the English language when you look it up, but in the results-based framework, it's really important. This difference is important to measure. So outputs is a consequence of our activities, as we just said, but the outcomes, you use the change language. So what has changed in the situation, in your context? So do I dare ask, what are some of the outcomes we expect in our program? And since you guys are so good, I'm going to put it out there in the chat. So please have a go. Okay, women motivated for further work. Yes, Altanai, that's super. That's a really nice outcome. Motivation, their satisfaction, their attitude. Improved attitudes. Yes, their joy, Jen. That's really good. Yes, the photo makes you think of improved attitudes. Yes, a little giveaway. Their improved skills. Yeah, these are all great outcomes that might be leading to our program and leading to the change we want to see, right? It could also be their conservation action because we want them to be conservationists in the area. That's the goal Ajay and team is working towards. So in terms of outcomes, there can be short-term, intermediate, and long-term. And Ajay shared that initially the outcomes they were thinking or expecting of the program was increasing livelihood security of women, right? So the improved income related to their ability to make income, but also their increased satisfaction towards the program itself in the short term. And in the immediate term, maybe improved attitudes towards conservation, but also towards carnivores and wildlife. And in the long term, actual conservation action and engagement in the area over time. So as you can see, all of these outcomes kind of interact, right? And they lead one to the other. So we normally don't have one, we have several, but that was really nice. So I trust then we can go ahead to the next stage. So the next stage is we looked at these elements in isolation, but it's critical to see the various elements clearly and linked, right? Because in the end, we're working towards that change we talked about in session 1. And the easiest way to do that is to use the if and then question. And it can help simplify and help us understand, okay, are these things linked? So if we put these inputs in place, then it leads to these activities that we are going to do. If we have our activities in place, then it's going to lead to these outputs. If we have these outputs, then it will lead to these outcomes, and so on and so on. So the point is to have this logical chain of events that leads to the change that you're expecting. And if anything doesn't lead to that change, then you might want to think, why am I even measuring this? Why am I even monitoring this? Or why am I even doing this if this activity, and if the activity is having a wider benefit and you can explain, then yeah, it makes sense. But especially for monitoring, it's important to think, okay, I'm monitoring this to understand that. I'm not just monitoring to just see. Yeah. So this might help you understand and figure out, okay, what are key aspects I need to monitor to see that change? So we're going to try this with the Shen program and do this chain example. Let's see how it works. So, and don't worry, I've done the hard work for us and just picked an example to simplify. So it's if we have the raw materials, trainings, and engagement, then we expect to be able to support training activities for women in SPT related to handicraft products. So if we produce handicrafts and build their capacities, then we expect additional income will be brought to the households of women. Yeah, that's the expectation. And if additional income is brought towards these households, then we expect them to have more ability in deciding the income expenditures. I mean, this is just assumptions. Remember, these are assumptions related, and there are wider forces at play, but this is what we're assuming. And then if they have better livelihoods and more income in the households, then we would expect them to have better attitude, improved attitudes toward conservation, and maybe even wider carnivores in the area. And together, improved livelihoods and improved attitudes may lead to conservation action. But in real life, it's maybe not as simple as that. And as Ajay clearly explained, the cost of the raw materials were very, very high, and income did not increase as expected. So this step did not actually take place. And they, in fact, it was quite low. The returns were quite low. And similarly, as Ajay kind of touched on, it was a little bit difficult to get the women to proactively engage in the conservation issues. There was a little bit of this gap of supporting them in that engagement, or engagement in conservation activities that the women thought were really relevant. And Ajay is going to share a little bit more about how he dealt with that later. But the team found these two casual processes didn't really confirm their original assumption, which is fine, but that's the process they went through. And that's what prompted a kind of adjustments based on their understanding of what was going on and the monitoring. So Ajay is going to share a little bit later about how they improved on this outcome related to the empowering the women to take action on local conservation issues, and how they did this in a participatory way. So that will come a little bit later. But essentially, what we're trying to do here is clarify our assumptions about each step of the way, right? And check if they are valid actually in practice in the context we're talking about. So it is important to note that these ifs and then linkages or assumptions are very context specific, as we talked about last time. And the program participants, such as the women taking part in the program, they'll have their visions on what the if and thens are, right? And they'll have really important insights to give to these casual linkages. So if we are to have an effective theory of change and mapping this, we could also do it in a participatory way by getting the women involved. And then in that way, identifying indicators that make sense to them and through the process. It doesn't have to be us deciding these casual linkages. I just wanted to note that as we move into the later discussions. But okay, so now we talked about this. Thank you everyone for staying with us. We're almost done. But I mean, we said we're talking about monitoring. So how does monitoring fit in? And some of you guys might be like, what is she talking about? She's talking about everything at once. So I want to go back to what is monitoring? How does it fit in? So monitoring, we tend to actually focus on these three first steps and what we talked about: the inputs, the activities, and the outputs, and sometimes outcomes as well, but it can be harder to measure those easily, and practically. And because we focus on these because they're easier to measure, and the causal chain, like the understanding of this leading to this, is more direct, so easier to prove. Right? Because as you go further up the chain, it's really hard to understand, was it my activities that led to that? And then it can be harder to understand your program contribution, as we discussed in the last session, right? So, and monitoring we talked about was repeatedly gathering data. So it has to be something practical. So we tend to focus on these lower down the chain. while evaluations tend to focus on this last segment of the chain, related to outputs to impacts. And we explained in last week's session, these are much harder to measure and can take time. It doesn't happen tomorrow. They might happen after many years. So an evaluation might happen every few years, and it needs different methods. It's not just recording over time. And so that's something we're going to come to next week. But in terms of the Shen example, I think Ajay really shared how they really focused on the costs of raw materials and tracking women's incomes to check their assumptions. And this really helped them reflect and make decisions on the way forward. But we're now going to touch upon a last question and go through together what to monitor. So we understand the causal framework and the underlying theory of change of our project, but let's come back to the question and try to figure out, because we can't monitor everything. We need to make those choices, right? And what were the basis of Ajay's choices? Well, how did he prioritize? So we've already gone through 3 of these. So a suggestion is really to focus on the lower parts of the chain, which are more casually linked to our activities. But to remember, it's also important to think of the critical causal linkages that lead to the change. And for Ajay, it was really the cost of raw materials, because that channeled into income and then the motivation of women. And that was a really critical factor in influencing whether the program was successful in reaching the goal of conservation action, right? So they really focused on those critical linkages. And of course, there's issues of practicality, costs, frequency, and usefulness. So these are things you can come back to when thinking about your program and thinking, okay, what do I monitor? Because we can't monitor everything, and if it's not useful, chuck it out. So I've listed here a few questions you can ask yourself related to cost and frequency. I'm not going to go over it now, but it might help you identify certain indicators that are practical for you. And they relate to, how accurate they are, but how long it takes in terms of staff time and so on, in terms of collecting baseline information. Maybe you need baseline information for that indicator, so it might take longer to collect, or maybe you don't. So these are some things that you can look at. But also, is the indicator useful? Does it help you adapt your strategy or inform your theory of change? And if it's not, then maybe chuck it out, depending on your goal, but think, simplify as much as possible. So it's important to think we are trying to monitor also our assumptions and how these assumptions change, as Ajay shared. So our monitoring strategy might change based on our assumptions, because there are so many unknowns out there. So we need to ask ourselves, what are the assumptions we're making? And are these assumptions true? Are they just really deep perceptions that we have that are taking place? So that's something that you might want to think about monitoring. And the role of monitoring is to check and challenge our assumptions, and then think about how to broaden or adapt our program. And you can choose indicators that monitor these assumptions. For example, monitoring whether women take part in the conservation programs, in terms of the Shen example, because that was an assumption that would take place, right, beyond the income generation activities. So you can monitor that to see if it's actually taking place. So, and then finally, remember from last session, we talked about how our programs are not in isolation, and there are wider forces at play. And those are also maybe critical for the change we want to see, and we might need to handle it in our monitoring framework. And it's important to refer back to these wider forces. So in terms of the Shen program, I think Ajay already gave us some hints about what these were, because SLE, or the enterprise program, was not happening in isolation of other forces in the area, such as other livelihood options that he shared, that the seasonal activity of women. But I wanted to ask you guys just quickly in the chat, what do you think could be wider forces that would influence the women's ability to become conservation actors that you could think are important to also monitor, that are beyond your program itself. So it's beyond your activities. These are wider forces taking place in Spiti that might influence your program. So maybe in the chat, if everyone wants to have a go. And Ajay, maybe I'll go back to you. Okay.
No, there are some coming through.
Okay. Yes. Security, maybe. Okay. Yeah. Security of women feeling safe in safe spaces. That's a really good one, Uzma. Yeah. Rishi, broader social ecological factors, other government programs taking place, the cultural context. Yeah. Whether women can actually have control over their income, where they can have those decision-making powers in the household. Traditional bodies, awareness, yeah, wider awareness of environmental issues. These are great, and I wish we had more time. I know we're a little bit tight on time, so we don't have time to actually do this exercise together, but I wish we could because it's really fun. And
it might come through in the activity as well, Justine.
Yeah, it will come through in the activities. But I've listed a few here that might be different from what others have said. But I think what Ajay shared related to what things they noticed was women's competing seasonal activities and their ability to only work a certain time of the year, and other products in the market, right? They were competing with other people selling products, and other livelihood options were these negative forces. And there were also positive forces, women's maybe access to technology or the political leadership in the area. And what's really interesting actually is we actually did this back in 2019. I don't know if Ajay and Juliet remember, and their team actually highlighted a range of really different forces that I didn't even list here. And it relates to wider conflict issues that was going on in Spiti. And it's interesting. So you work with different teams, and different people might highlight different issues that they think is really important and might influence the project's success. So just quickly then, another choice that will influence what you will choose is whether you are using qualitative or quantitative information. And what we've all talked about today have been really about measuring, right? Quantitative information. But numbers might not tell you the whole story. And it's also important to understand the why and explain the why, right? So you can also monitor with qualitative information. And this is just a little blurb you can look at later that talks about people obsessed with numbers, right? And we forget the qualitative information are also important. So this qualitative information, can be collected through logbooks and evidence of change books. And Ajay will share a little bit more about this later. And it's particularly good for working with community members because it captures the details that's happening in their daily life. And things that we as program coordinators maybe forget, right? Because we're focusing on the bigger picture, where they're really seeing what's happening on the ground and what's important to them, and the more nuanced changes taking place. And the participants also in this way can decide what's important to them in terms of indicators on what to write down, which is also a great way to engage them. So together you can have quantitative and qualitative information. And this is just an example of a framework one could use to bring it together. You could have in the blue, the qualitative information, quantitative information, and in the green, the qualitative information about the wider context or the context in place. And together, then you can create lessons and reflections. So these were just some other suggestions when you think about what to monitor, to think about these wider forces, these negative forces. And in terms of Shen and other programs, you might have to have these gender sensitive, right? The way these indicators, they need to think about how many women versus men are involved as well. And think about your assumptions and qualitative versus quantitative. And finally, participants' viewpoints. So my final slide, I just wanted to say, was to remind everyone that the goal of monitoring isn't about proving or disproving your program, whether it's succeeding. It's about learning, right, and adapting the program. So what I shared today kind of gives you the fundamentals behind planning your monitoring. It might seem very linear, but it doesn't have to be. There's a way to balance having this framework with what needs to be done in practice, which is what Ajay is really highlighting. So I think we're trying to provide you kind of both sides of it, so you can see, you know, this importance of having this framework to bring it all together, and then what actually happens in practice. And monitoring plan will always have to adapt, but based on this local context and change over time, as Ajay shared with the Shen example. So I hope you guys are still with us, because we're going to move into a fabulous activity. Go for it, Juliet.
Okay. Thank you very much, Justine, for that. That was a really useful input there, because in this activity, so we're going to go into small breakout groups like we did last week for about a quarter of an hour. And what we're going to do is we're going to discuss as a small group some of the goals that you have in your conservation programs. And obviously here we can remember the headline that we thought about last week. But here we're thinking about the indicators that you feel would be most important in order to actually get there. So these can be indicators at any stage of the chain, as Justine explained earlier. But what we'll also be discussing is why you decide to make those choices. So when we think of the sort of top 3 indicators, in a way, it's not the only ones, right? We're not going to be restricted to that. There will be others, but we're just asking you to focus on the ones that you think will be really key to tell you whether you're on the right way to reach your goal. And we're going to explore why you made those choices. So, you know, the sort of qualitative versus quantitative, looking at whether the indicators are more about input, output, outcome, whether they're indicators of the wider forces that may then impact on your program, etc. And then if we have a little bit of time, so we've got about a quarter of an hour for the breakout group. If we've got a bit of time, we'll also think about what sorts of participatory monitoring you could put in place to actually gather information about those indicators. So we'll go into the breakout group now for about a quarter of an hour. And then when we come back, we'll ask you to put your indicators, your sort of top 3 indicators in the Mentimeter software. And then we can have a look at them to see where they fit in that whole sort of process that Justine described, and also whether we can learn from each other in terms of interesting indicators that we can use. So I think Justine, will you be inviting us to groups?
Yeah, can Raki make me host?
Well, thank you very much for that. We had a lovely discussion on indicators in my group. So maybe now, Justine, did you share already the link for the Mentimeter? Yes, we can't hear you because you're muted. Fine.
No worries. I put it in the chat.
Super.
So please, our team already submitted.
Oh, great.
Our things, but please go ahead and submit.
Excellent. So if all the teams could submit their indicators through the Mentimeter, and then we'll see them as they come up. And maybe, Justine, you could start when they come up to sort of look at whether they're input indicators, activity indicators, outputs, or outcome indicators.
Yeah, sure. How did people find that? Was that a difficult exercise? How was it for you guys, Juliet?
In our group, it went very well. Actually, the members of my group had already thought of indicators, and then all we did was then refine them a little bit, just to make them maybe more focused or clearer and easier then to gather information about them. But that was it. Yeah. I don't know how the other groups got on. How did your group get on, Justine?
Yeah, our group, which was a really great, we had some really nice discussion, Altanai, Rishi, and I think, I mean, I see some of our indicators, we focused on the program itself.
Okay.
And our group really highlighted how if the program wasn't implemented at all, how could we even, why even bother measuring whether people's incomes were increasing, because no handicrafts were being made, which I think was a really good point by Ursula. So that was something that was put forward. So, and I think I see that activities, even just the basic activities, was the one key one that was highlighted. And then the team then focused on income and seeing whether these activities of handicrafts actually increased to the assumption of increased income through maybe the quality of our products. But and then finally, and a final really nice by Altanai's suggestion was then trying to think, okay, how many women are actually taking part? And if you only have 2 women in the community, it might not lead to the change you're looking for. Right. So then indicator could be about looking how many women within the community are taking part. And that could give you a kind of understanding of how far your program is reaching in terms of the wider community. So I think those were really some really nice points put forward. I don't know. I mean, I see here many other indicators related to livestock vaccinated, and these seem to be from wider forces. I don't know if Ajay's team want to share a little bit about your
in our group, Uzma was sharing her experience from Pakistan, and uh, she she uh, she did something interesting of trying to reflect on the vaccination program. Though she's not directly involved with it, she was trying to refer to uh, her own experiences of working with the community and seeing what would be important indicators. And I think most of those were like output indicators of a number of livestock vaccinated or a number of shepherds benefiting. But she made an important point that this could be both qualitative as well as quantitative. That while it might be important to gather uh, quantitative inputs or outputs, it might also be useful to measure perceptions and so on. Flavia was reflected back on her experience of working with a community in Alaska, and as that she did as a young researcher, and she was trying to understand whether these communities would be willing to work on an idea like that. And we felt that that was more like having a baseline survey done to see if there was preparedness. So maybe just in pointing back to something that you spoke. And Jen was also in a group, and she was talking about how to make these participatory and how to the process of it. And that's, I think, when I got thrown out of the group. But it was a useful discussion in the group as well. So I think the livestock vaccination is coming from there.
Super. No, I think that's key. Yeah, the highlighting it's not just quantitative. Oh, yeah, we focused really on quantitative again. We were really biased. It's nice that your team went further than that, which was super. I don't know if Nadia has some thoughts from her team as well. Nadia?
Yes, our group was pretty straightforward, and we just immediately brought up these indicators, but most of them were quantitative because we thought because it's easier to measure, and we believe those quantitative information are more robust and easy to manage and easier to repeat. So I think we did pretty much a cross-cutting thing. So yeah, it went pretty easy. Yeah.
I mean, I can see a few qualitative ones in the ones that have been suggested. For example, the ways in which people have benefited from a program. that could be very qualitative in terms of asking them the range of ways in which they may have benefited, which then may lead to, in subsequent years, maybe some more quantitative indicators on specific benefits that they might have gained. So, I think that also highlights the fact that there can be that mixing of qualitative and quantitative indicators, as Justine was saying earlier, which can come in and can evolve over time as well. But that looks really nice. And I like some of them, that may go a little bit further as well, like the conflict zone decrease. So I don't know how that indicator would work, but it's it's sort of highlighting this need to sort of focus on the fact that there is obviously a zone where there's particularly high conflict. Maybe that zone is known already, and you can sort of look at that in that way. But obviously, that's an example of something where the indicator might need to be refined in order to actually get the information that's needed there. That's brilliant.
Super. Okay. So I mean, we do have, sorry.
What?
We do have explanations, but I think it was really nice to hear from the teams themselves. So we don't need to share that Mentimeter results, but we'll share by email the results.
Great. That would be great. Thank you, Justine.
Yeah.